So new intro, new colours, who this? I know, right? It's time to make things look like an actual YouTube channel instead of the low budget stuff that I've been doing for God knows how long. I mean, even Simon Whistler has some sort of budget. But yes, back to the stuff that I do on this channel, and if you watch the previous Storytime episode, which was about the 1995 Indy 205, at least it was for the winner Jacques Villeneuve, you'll know that in that video I talked about how it was the last Indy 500 before the infamous split, or to call it what it was, Racing Civil War. Now, the way I would have done Storytime in the past is just do the full story as a 20-minute video, or however long it would take. But the thing about the split is, because it set American open wheel racing back about 20 years, even more, and had so much going on because there's chaotic races, there's the politics and all that other stuff, it's probably better to split, no pun intended, this one into sub-stories so that A, it doesn't take me forever to research just one video, and B, you get a steady stream of content. So for this one I'll talk about the how and why it started, and then in another video I'll look at the debacle that was Texas 2001, the concerns about safety and things like that, another one about reunification and so on and so on and so on, but we'll cross those bridges when we get to them. So let's get into it then. Now, what needs pointing out here is that in the mid-1990s, Championship Auto Racing Teams, or CART as it was better known, was at its peak. Attendances, commercial appeal, star power, it had the lot, and it was leaving NASCAR for dust, and CART itself had been formed in the late 1970s by some of the teams, hence the name, and in itself been a split of USAC, or USAC. It was bordering on Formula 1 in terms of scope. It had races in the United States, Canada, and a race in Australia, at least at about 1994 or so, but even though it had initially been a split of something else, CART was prospering, and Bernie Ecclestone and Bill France of Formula 1 and NASCAR respectively were looking over their shoulders as a result. By 1994, Lola, Penske and Reynard were building chassis. Ford, Ilmor, Honda, Buick and Greenfield were engine suppliers. Goodyear was the sole tyre supplier, but in 1995 Firestone would be back, and in the 1994 season 14 of the drivers who took part in at least one race had, or would, race in Formula 1, including former world champions Nigel Mansell, Mario Andretti and Emerson Fittipaldi, as well as future champion Jacques Villeneuve. Now, if you're GP Laps, Empty Box or David Land, you probably know all of this, but I'm putting this into basic Euro speak because we think it's just turning left. But this is the thing, it wasn't all just turning left. You've got Laguna Seca, Portland and Road America, they're road courses. You've then got Surfers Paradise, Detroit, Toronto, Vancouver, Long Beach, which are street circuits, and the rest are ovals. There was even a race at an airport. So you have three disciplines, if you want to call them that, which would require drivers to play to different strengths or just become an all-rounder, if that's even possible. And as I already mentioned, you've got names of Mansell, Fittipaldi and similar in the sport, and that increased the international appeal. But behind the scenes, things weren't so rosy. The owners of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway at this time was a family called the George family, and the president was Tony George, then in his late 30s, and he had some big plans brought on by some big thoughts. Now, Tony George is the grandson of the late Tony Hullman, who had resurrected the Speedway after the Second World War. Essentially, Tony believed he was being cast aside by the board of directors at CART, and believed his opinions regarding costs, revenue sharing and so on were being ignored. While on the other side, the CART directors felt that George was trying to get a little bit too much control. So, put simply, George was a non-voting member of the board. He was on the council, but he didn't have the rank of master. The CART board saw him as the guy who owned Indianapolis, while George thought that because his venue hosted the biggest event of the year, he should be allowed into the exclusive club. There was also an element of it ain't how it used to be anymore for George, because back in the USAC days and even into the formation of CART, the progression was generally that the drivers went from dirt ovals, so midget sprints and things like that, to Formula Atlantic and then Indy Lights and then up to the crown jewel that is the Indy 500 or the CART season as a whole, or the CART season as a whole, I should probably say. Much like how a football player in Europe or England, starting at a lower league club like Walsall and then eventually playing for Liverpool in the FA Cup final. And thanks to people who left comments on that 1995 Indy 500 video, because it was quite helpful in gauging points in time and history and stuff like that. It actually looked like the days of what I just mentioned, the dirts up to the Indy 500, those days had ended by about 1982 or so, when the likes of Fittipaldi and co started coming over to America after their F1 careers had ended or really failed to get going. And Indycars at that point were on par in terms of power, or at least getting there, maybe more. I think in the 90s they had more engine power with less downforce or something ridiculous like that. Put simply, George wanted the good old days back, and there were a lot of people in the American Midwest who agreed with him, thinking that there were too many road racers and ride buyers from Europe coming over and ruining their sport. So there was some more backroom talking going on in the background, and George started to feel more and more alienated. He then said screw this and decided to form his own racing series that was low cost, more equal in terms of car performance instead of being dominated by the big boys like Penske, and then being run exclusively on ovals to keep the purity of that old style oval racing ladder. But he did have one extra weapon in his back pocket, the Indy 500. And at the time it was claimed that George was using the Indy 500 as a weapon against kart and to be a way of gaining complete control of open wheel racing in the United States. So up until about 1996, the Indy 500 was a USAC sanctioned event, while all the other events on the kart calendar such as Toronto, Laguna Seca, Phoenix and so on were sanctioned by kart. Now though, the rulebook was in George's corner and he actually did have control of the sandpit. The Stanley Cup final was no longer part of the NHL season. By that, what I mean is the Indy 500 became part of this new racing series, the Indy Racing League. It was no longer part of the kart calendar, and George announced this new series just days before Villeneuve's win at the 1995 Indy 500, and the kart teams were not happy. They called George delusional. The press called him delusional. They said it would never work. They said it was going to kill what was at the time the only open wheel series capable of rivaling Formula 1. And to make sure that the point was really hammered home to the kart teams, George made up a new rule, the 25-8 rule. The Indy 500 has 33 cars, at least that's the maximum that's allowed to start, the Indy 500. What George did was basically guarantee a slot in the race for the top 25 drivers in the IRL point standings, and if the kart teams wanted to participate, they'd have to qualify against the remaining IRL cars, which would mean that teams like Penske and the like might not actually make it to the grid. The season was also rigged in such a way that IRL races would be on the same day as kart races, so if the kart teams wanted to get a guaranteed spot in the Indy 500, they would have to race on the IRL calendar. And as you can imagine, kart told George to do one, and then held its own race on the same day as the Indy 500 over the Michigan International Speedway instead. So cue some confusion. Sponsors didn't know what to do because they were banking on teams winning the Indy 500. Drivers didn't know what to do because they wanted to race in the Indy 500. The teams didn't know what to do because they needed those sponsors that wanted them to race in the Indy 500. And then the fans didn't know what to do because they wanted to watch the Indy 500, but the names on the grid weren't anybody that they recognised. So ticket values plummeted. But it still wasn't rosy for the US 500 over at Michigan either. It did have a massive crowd, but those seats were filled by employees and families of the sponsors, and free tickets were dished out. But Michigan at least had a crowd, so visually they had the upper hand. But then it started to not look so good because Jimmy Vasser caused a massive pile-up before the green flag even dropped, and that wiped out at least 10 cars. So kart, to avoid further embarrassment, basically said, right, grab your spare cars, get them ready, and get back on the grid. It took them over an hour to get everything fixed and ready, but they barely completed 2 laps before the yellow flags were out again, and then they'd had 4 or 5 cautions before lap 67. The race was actually won in a dose of turbo irony by Jimmy Vasser, who was later called Jimmy Vasshole by the Indy 500 purists because he was drinking milk in Victory Lane. But because of the massive pile-up caused before the start of the kart race, the IRL could now put on its race and show kart how it's done. The IRL didn't really have a leg to stand on in the grand scheme of things because there had been a death in testing and it had been raining quite hard, and it was actually one of the wettest Mays on record. In addition, they had to fill the grid with cars, most of which were ex-kart chassis. It was also supposed to be the all-American race, but some of those flags ain't American. In terms of attrition, it didn't go much better than US 500 because it was quite crash happy, and only 3 cars finished on the lead lap. And to make things a tad more comical, the winner of the race was Buddy Lazier, who was a kart regular that allowed kart to have some of the bragging rights back because it was one of kart's guys that had won on the enemy's turf. 17 of the starters in the 1996 Indy 500 were rookies, and only one of them, in Arie Luyendyk, was a previous winner. The only rookie on the grid that would achieve some sort of superstardom was Tony Stewart, but even then, he soon departed the IRL to become a firm fixture in NASCAR. So here then becomes the start of the Indycar kart split, and things will soon change in terms of who has the upper hand and who should have done X and who should have done Y in terms of the war. We still also need to cover things like the Texas fiasco and the safety with that, and how that kind of crippled kart, and how money was affected, and how NASCAR caught up, and there's even a cameo from a certain Bernie Ecclestone. So if you want to find out when the next video in this little mini-series comes out, or just any of my videos in general, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and just to be safe, get that bell on as well so you'll be guaranteed to know when the next video is up. Not a guarantee. Thanks to the patrons of this channel via Patreon. If you wish to donate to help cover things like image use, gear, software and stuff like that, all of that goes back into the channel. There will be a link in the description, as well as links to Discord and to Twitter, Instagram, and yeah, all of that gubbins as well. And some of you are probably wondering where this came from. This is thanks to MSI Esports. They are the people that made this fetching little number for the esports stuff that I do. They reached out to me just before Christmas to make up a little something, and we're still tweaking some bits and pieces on this first prototype, but who knows, if we get something that looks pretty cool and you people want to buy it, then maybe that can be set up. I don't know. Maybe I should really talk to them about that. But anyway, that's it from me. I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. So until then, goodbye.